Ever heard of an engine that could run on peanut butter? Car companies have tried some wild ideas to make engines better. Some were super cool, but they just didn't work out. From spinning triangles to jet engines in cars, these 10 engine ideas were big deals, but ended up being more trouble than they were worth. Number 10, the Wankel rotary engine. Let's kick things off with the Wankel rotary engine, a real head-scratcher that used a spinning triangle instead of regular pistons. This engine, found in cars like the Mazda RX-7, was small, smooth, and could rev like crazy. The typical 13 BREW engine, a popular version, had a displacement of just 1.3 liters, but thanks to twin turbochargers, could produce around 255 horsepower and 217 pound-feet of torque, but it had its flaws. The main thing that failed the engine was the apex seals, which were the little guys at the tips of the rotor. Because the seals were very difficult to work with, these had to handle insane heat and pressure, often failing way sooner than anyone wanted. Think about it. A regular engine has nice round cylinders. This thing had a triangle spinning around in an oval. It was also a gas guzzler and produced emissions, so it wasn't the best engine for the Earth. All these factors made for a recipe for disaster. That all leads to a ton of oil burning and fuel inefficiency. The RX-7, for example, might only get you 15 to 18 miles per gallon. Not great for the wallet. It was a neat idea, but ultimately not very practical for everyday cars. Number 9, Chrysler turbine engine. Next, let's talk about an engine that sounded like something out of the Jetsons, the Chrysler turbine engine. Back in the 1960s, Chrysler built around 50 cars with engines that were like mini-jet turbines. This engine could supposedly run on almost anything, from kerosene to tequila, though I wouldn't recommend trying that. Its engine was a 4th generation A831. It produced 130 horsepower and a massive 425 pound-feet of torque at 0 RPM, meaning you were ready to take off the moment you put your foot down. But this engine was very complex. It was super expensive to make, very loud, and not very fuel efficient compared to normal engines. One of the biggest technical headaches was the exhaust temperature, which could reach over 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit at idle. That's hot enough to melt asphalt. Plus, it puts out a lot of nitrogen oxides, which are bad for the air. So while it was cool in theory, it wasn't ready for prime time. Number 8, General Motors 2.7-liter V8 diesel. Now let's jump to the 1970s and the Oldsmobile 350 diesel, a diesel engine GM put in its cars during the oil crisis. This 5.7-liter V8 was supposed to be fuel efficient, but ended up being a major headache. The engine was supposed to produce around 125 horsepower and 225 pound-feet of torque. But GM basically took a gasoline engine and tried to make it a diesel without making it strong enough. The head bolts weren't strong enough to handle the high compression of a diesel engine, often leading to blown head gaskets. And the worst part? It produced a lot of engine vibration and was just plain unreliable. Many owners reported problems like water in the fuel, and the engine often needed major repairs before even hitting 50,000 miles. It gave diesels a bad name for a long time. But why would a big company like GM release an engine with so many problems? Didn't they test these things? Let's dive into what went wrong behind the scenes. It seems that GM rushed this engine to market to meet growing demands for fuel-efficient cars. They didn't make the engine strong enough to handle the high pressures of being a diesel. The head bolts, for example, were the same as those used in their gasoline engines, which are not designed for the much higher compression of a diesel engine. The fuel injection system was also problematic, often leading to water contamination and poor performance. Because of all these issues, drivers found their engines failing fast, sometimes in as little as 20,000 miles, leading to lots of upset customers and costly repairs. Number 7, Ford's 427 SOHC V8. All right, now, for a muscle car legend that didn't quite make it. Ford's 427 SOHC V8, also known as the Camry. This engine was designed for racing, specifically NASCAR, and it was a beast. SOHC stands for Single Overhead Cam, meaning it had one camshaft above each cylinder head, a design that allowed for higher RPMs. It had a displacement of 7 liters and could crank out a monstrous 616 horsepower and 515 pound-feet of torque in its racing form. But it was also expensive to make and hard to keep running smoothly. This was no engine for your daily commute. NASCAR even banned it because it was too powerful. The complexity of the overhead cam design, with its long timing chains and precise valve adjustments, made it more suited for race teams with deep pockets than for regular drivers. So while it was a legend on the track, it never made it into regular Ford cars. Number 6. Cadillac V8. Next up, Cadillac's V864. An early try at making an engine that could switch off cylinders to save fuel. This 6-liter V8 could run on 8, 6, or 4 cylinders, depending on how much power you needed. The idea was, when you're cruising, you don't need all 8 cylinders, so the engine would shut some off. It was supposed to produce 140 horsepower when all cylinders were firing. But the technology was way ahead of its time. The computer controlling the system wasn't very smart, leading to rough transitions between modes. Imagine your car suddenly feeling like it lost half its power. The system was also unreliable, with sensors often failing and causing the engine to run poorly. Cadillac quickly ditched the idea after just a couple of years. So, here's the kicker. Sometimes these failures weren't just about bad design, but about timing and cost. The V864, for instance, was a great idea, but the computers in 1981 just weren't up to the task. Today, many cars use a similar system, but with much better computers, it works great. It highlights how the technology that's around at the time can make or break a good idea. Number 5. Oldsmobile Rocket V8. Now let's go back to the 1950s and the Oldsmobile Rocket V8, one of the first high-performance V8 engines. This engine was a big deal in its day, offering lots of power and speed. The original 1949 version had a displacement of 5 liters and produced around 135 horsepower, which was pretty impressive for the time. But as time went on, it became clear that it wasn't very fuel efficient and it produced a lot of pollution. The early versions were known for burning oil, and by the 1970s, with fuel economy and emissions becoming more important, the Rocket V8 got replaced by smaller, more efficient engines. Number 4. Buick's Nailhead V8. Another blast from the past is Buick's Nailhead V8. This engine got its name from its small vertical valves that looked like nails. The 401 cubic inch version, a popular choice, produced 325 horsepower and a hefty 445 pound-feet of torque. The design allowed for a high compression ratio, giving it good power for its time. But the small valves limited how much air the engine could breathe, especially at high RPMs. Think of it like trying to breathe through a tiny straw. By the 1970s, newer engines with bigger valves and better airflow were making more power and running cleaner. So the Nailhead, while cool, just couldn't keep up. Number 3. Chrysler 2.2-liter turbo engine. Let's zoom to the 1980s and Chrysler's 2.2-liter turbo engine. This little 4-cylinder engine used a turbocharger to boost its power, making it a fun, peppy engine for cars like the Dodge Daytona. The early versions produced around 146 horsepower, which was a lot for a small engine in those days. But it had turbo lag, meaning you had to wait a bit for the turbo to kick in, which could be annoying. It also had a lot of reliability issues. The turbochargers were prone to early failure, and the engine often suffered from oil leaks and head gasket problems. While it was exciting when it worked, it often didn't work for long. Number 2. Ford's Vega engine. Now for a real lemon, the Chevrolet Vega engine. This aluminum engine was supposed to be lightweight and efficient, but it was a disaster. The 2.3-liter inline-4 engine produced a modest 70 to 90 horsepower, but the engine block was made of aluminum without steel cylinder liners, which was a big mistake. The engine was very likely to overheat, causing the cylinder walls to warp and the pistons to scrape. Owners reported massive oil consumption and engine failures, sometimes even before 30,000 miles. Number 1. AMC's 401 V8. Finally, let's talk about AMC's 401 V8. This was a big, powerful engine used in cars like the AMC Javelin. The 6.6-liter V8 cranked out around 330 horsepower and 430 pound-feet of torque in its prime, making it a real muscle car contender. But it was heavy and thirsty, especially as fuel economy became more important. When stricter pollution rules came in, this big engine just couldn't keep up. AMC eventually focused on smaller, more efficient engines, and the 401 was retired. So you might be wondering, if these engines had so many issues, why did car companies keep trying new things? Shouldn't they have just stuck with what worked? Well, car companies are always trying to push the limits, to make cars faster, more efficient, and better for the environment. Sometimes these experiments fail, but they often learn something valuable in the process. For example, while the Vega engine was a failure, it helped engineers learn how to use aluminum in engines better, leading to lighter and more efficient engines later on. And there you have it, 10 engine breakthroughs that didn't quite make it. From spinning triangles to jet engines, these ideas were bold, but they just couldn't stand the test of time. Let me know in the comments if you've ever dealt with any of these engine nightmares. Like this for more car content, and subscribe for more deep dives into the world of cars. Catch you next time.